guys. Thursday night, man. It is great to see you all. Faces we haven't seen in a while. It is awesome, man. I love Thursdays. Seeing you guys. I look forward to it all week, man. It's incredibly motivating. I mean, it's just wow. Thank you for being here tonight and supporting the ministry, gentlemen. In this, I mean, this particular chapter of Exodus is, you know, a lot of people don't look much into it. It's not something that you read much about it. It's just a simple conversation, between Moses and God, and much of the book of Exodus, for the early chapters is just about that. But it speaks volumes to us as men. Because you see, when Moses confronted the Lord at that point on the mountaintop, Moses was 80 years old. He was a fugitive from Egypt for killing an Egyptian. He was stripped of his princely title. He was despised by the Egyptians, and he was hated by the Jews because he was neither Jewish for them, or nor the Egyptians thought he was a real Egyptian, because Moses at that time had an identity crisis going on, would be a lot. So here's this 80-year-old man away from his country, lost his riches, lost everything. He finds himself in the middle of a desert, sheep herding. And at that time, let me focus that. I mean, we see it as glamorous because David was a shepherd and this and that. No, sheep herding was the lowest thing you can do in that time period. It was looked upon with with disgrace. If you were a shepherd, you might as well, be a sanitation worker, or, clean porta johns for a living, and I'm not dissing on the profession. Somebody's got to do it. But it was looked upon that by society. So Moses was shepherding not his own flock, but that of his father-in-law. So what he had wasn't even his own. So we see Moses in probably one of the worst midlife crises a man can face. He's lost his identity. He's lost his country. He's working for somebody else. He's working a very menial position. And, it doesn't go much. The Bible doesn't go into much in his relationship with his wife and his children and whatnot. But like any man, I'm sure he was having difficulties at home. So we see Moses in probably one of the worst times of his life. And he shows up before God, and God says, "What's in your hand?" It's a simple question. You would think that the Almighty would have come with something, more deep, more profound. He simply asked Moses, "What's in your hand?" And Moses just said, "A staff, a rod." You see, in that rod would have probably been about 6 feet tall, give or take, with a crook on the top. And it served two purposes. One, to keep the sheep in line by giving them a soft, gentle tap. And the other one was to keep the sheep herder, you would lean on it. It was more like a cane, because at that age, you couldn't stand for long periods of time. So Moses was probably leaned on that just to stand up for most of the day for his activities. So this was Moses' identity. Moses was tending sheep. That's who he was. So when God said, "What's in your hand?" Moses said, "Staff. That's all I got. That's all I am." If I ask, so many of us here, "What's in your hands?" You would, for me, I would say, "Well, my badge. That's who I am. And, an officer." For many of us here in this chat tonight, or some would say pastor, or, whatever your profession is, whatever you do, that's how you would identify. We as men, we identify with our profession. We take pride in our profession. Some of us are not happy in our profession, but we do it because it pays the bills. I'm sure Moses wasn't thrilled to be a sheep herder at the time, but it's where that's where God had placed him. He went from the palace down to herding sheep. And so I can identify with Moses at this moment of his life, because I mean, his whole world was pretty much collapsing. And he comes to God, and he's standing before God, and God's asking that one simple question: "It's in your hands." And he said, okay, throw it down. And Moses obeyed God, and he threw down and the staff became a snake. And if you know anything about catching snakes, you don't catch a snake by the tail, because that thing is going to whip around and snap and bite you. You want to grab it by the head. That is the most strategic point to gathering a snake. So Moses backed up. He was afraid. But he did as God commanded him, and he picked it up, and it turned back into the staff. From there on out, the staff of Moses became the rod of God. That rod sat and still is, to the best of my knowledge, still in the Ark of the Covenant, where the showbread, the staff of Moses, the rod of the staff of Moses, and the tablets, it became something bigger and greater than Moses could ever imagine. You see, Moses saw his life as an 80-year-old fugitive, a wanted man from the law for murder. He saw himself as a miserable sheep herder. He saw himself probably in a somewhat mediocre marriage, with problems probably with his children, and no future ahead of him. But Moses had, number one, placed himself in that position because of the choices he had made previous to Exodus chapter 4. God never told him to murder the Egyptian, never told him to do half the things he did. They didn't tell him to flee. But nonetheless, Moses arrived at this juncture in Exodus 4, and now he's facing the Almighty God. And I think that's where many of us are at tonight. We're looking back at our lives and we're saying, well, how did I get here? We look back at either the highlights or the messes that we've made, but they've all been with these hands. These were the hands that caused the destruction. It was Moses' hands that, with his very hands, he choked out the Egyptian and killed him. It was his very hands that would herd the sheep. And the calluses that were built up on there, he felt that every single day of his failure. So I think we reflect so much with him because we see our lives so much in Moses. Here we are midway through our lives. Some of us are coming up on that point, or some of us might even be beyond. And we're looking back and we're saying, what have I done? What's in my hands? What's right and what's wrong? What went well, and where did I mess up? So Moses, I'm sure, grasps that question. And then God's asking him, what's in your hand, Moses? Because you see, whatever was in Moses' hands, no matter how good he thought it was a disaster. Because obviously, he wasn't where God wanted him to be. Moses was out in the middle of the Sinai herding sheep when Moses was supposed to be delivering his people. But Moses didn't see himself as a deliverer, because if you see in the chapter before, he's arguing with God even about speaking. And that he couldn't speak because he stuttered. So he's fighting with God against his calling. But Moses had messed up royally. He blew it. And so God was asking Moses, what's in your hands? And if you surrender what's in your hands, Moses, I can turn it around. I can make something out of nothing, out of everything that you've messed up. I can change it and get you something bigger than you will ever realize it. But you got to let go. You got to surrender it to me. And you see, I think today that most of us, we come up before God and we stand before that burning bush, and we have that burning bush moment. And God says to us, well, what's in your hand, Joe? Or what's in your hand? And I'm like, well, my badge, my career, my wife, my children, my finances, my health, all these things, my home, my future. And God's asking us, are you willing to let that go and surrender it to me? Because so far, Joe, you've held on to it. And things really didn't work out the way you wanted it to, no? Because I think a lot of us would look in that mirror and say, maybe it didn't work out the way we wanted it. Maybe our kids didn't grow up the way we wanted them to. Maybe my marriage isn't the perfect thing that I wanted it to be. Maybe my finances are a hot mess because, wow, I messed things up. Maybe my life isn't where God wants me to be. Maybe I could have been something bigger and greater for the kingdom, but I'm stuck, shepherding sheep out of my own device. But when God says, what's in your hands? And you say, yeah, they're in my hands, but I'm not willing to let go of them, God. And that's where the problem starts. That's where the argument starts with God. Because you see, we want to control our finances. We don't want to give God our finances. We want to control our children. We don't want to surrender our children to God. We want to try to fix our marriage. We don't want to go before God and say, hey, I need you to fix my marriage. We want to hold on to our careers because this is what we like. But if God is calling us to do something else, but I don't like that, God. I like this. And then we're miserable in the careers that we're at. And we can start picking apart our entire lives, chapter by chapter, because we're holding on to something. We're holding on to our identity. Every man's identity is based on his career, his family, his wealth, and what he's got. It's just a fact. If I walk into a room of guys that you don't know, and the first thing you ask them, hey, how are you? They're going to tell you what they do for a living because they want to one-up you. They're going to tell you I own a boat. They're going to tell you I'm a lawyer. They're going to tell you I'm a doctor. They're going to tell you I went to Europe last year. I did this, I did that. My kids are at Harvard. We're going to just start spitting out things because we want to feel something. We want to feel that, hey, we accomplished something. Nobody walks into a room and says, oh, I'm just a sheep herder. I'm wanted, by the way, in Egypt for murder. So, shh, keep it on the down low. But that's where we're at. We're wanted men. And we're running from an almighty God who's waiting and asking the one question, just like he asked Moses, what's in your hands? What's in your hands tonight? Some of us, it's a wife, a marriage, a career, maybe children who have wandered away. Maybe it's a diagnosis from a doctor that we don't want to hear. Maybe it's anxiety, it's depression, it's worry. And so we're coming to God, with all these things in our hands like this. And we're just holding on to it for dear life because we identify with these things. Our problems become our identity. And God's asking, drop it on the floor. Oh no, God, you see, if I drop this on the floor, it's gonna be total disaster. You're good at creating the universe, the stars, the heavens, DNA, photosynthesis, all the animals, you name it, you did it. Bravo. But these problems here in my hands, no, man, you can't deal with it. I got to deal with this. I got to hold on to these because I know how to take care of this. And he whispers in our ear and says, you're not doing a great job of it. Drop it on the floor. And so he's asking us to simply drop what we have, to surrender our lives, really surrender our lives to him, to take our marriage and put it before him, to take our children and put it before him, to take our careers and put it before him, our finances, our dreams, our goals, our anxiety, our fears, our depressions, our addictions. And he says, lay it on the floor. And I'm going to transform it into something great. And then I'm going to ask you to pick it up. And it's going to transform. But you see, Moses had to take the first step. He had to drop that staff. It wasn't more of an act of just dropping a stick on the floor. He dropped his identity. He dropped his life. He dropped everything before God. That is the magnitude of that moment. It wasn't just throwing a stick on the ground to see what magic trick was going to happen. He threw everything on the table there before God, and he said, here I am. This is me. This is me in a 6-foot stick. There it is. And what God did with that stick, it scared him. He stepped back of fear. But God said, pick it back up again. Don't pick it up by the head, Moses, pick it up by the tail. Because he knew that from there on out, this was going to be a roller coaster. And when Moses picked up that stick, it became the staff of God. And with that same staff, Moses parted the Red Sea. With that same staff, Moses tapped the rock and water came out from it, and the Israelites and the Hebrews drank water from it. From that same staff, when Moses was raised that staff, the battles were won. And when that staff was lowered, the battles were lost. That staff guided millions of Hebrews across the desert into the promised land. It was in the Ark of the Covenant. It was a battle cry for an entire nation. It wasn't just a walking stick anymore. Moses didn't lean on it because he was old. It was because he was leaning on God at that point. He was leaning on the power and grace of the living God that said, pick it up. But none of that was going to happen if Moses would have never dropped it and surrendered it to God. Moses would not been the Moses we know, the deliverer, the one that the Jewish, country, Israeli country idolizes, that we still talk about today, 2021, the great deliverer of the Hebrew people, if he would not drop that staff in front of God. He would have just been another character in the Bible. And from chapter 4, there would have been no chapter 5. Maybe Joshua would have come in, who knows? And the Bible would have been totally rewritten. But by one act of obedience, Moses dropped the staff and he waited on God to do something great. Gentlemen, my question is for you tonight. Are you willing to drop your staff? Are you willing to drop what is in your hands before the living God and say, God, here's my wife, here's my kids, here's my family, here's everything at your feet. I'm dropping it before you. And when I pick it up, I don't know how it's going to be, if it's going to be a snake, if it's going to be a rod, if it's going to be the staff of God. Am I going to be able to part the seas with it? Am I going to be able to tap a rock and water is going to come out from it? I don't know. But I got to take that chance. And that's what I'm asking you tonight. What is in your hands tonight? Because whatever it is, if you can tell me with 100% certainty that it's all good, I won't be here next Thursday. But you can't. I can't. Because I need, just like you, to drop my staff. I need to drop my identity before the living God and say, it's yours. It's yours to change. It's yours to mold. It's yours to shape. It's yours to do what you need to do to get me through this. I don't know what you're going through tonight. Some things I do and some things I don't. But if you don't drop your staff before God tonight, you will continue to be just a shepherd in the middle of the desert, shepherding somebody else's sheep, running as a fugitive your whole entire life from God, wondering what could have been when he has something bigger and greater for you. And it's not at the drop of a hat, it's at the drop of a staff. Silvana was with me when we heard this we heard a pastor say a sermon about this, and it is excellent. So I'm not taking no credit for this whatsoever. And he came out and did the best illustration I've ever heard. And he took a racket and he says, this Wilson racket, in my hands is just an average racket. He says, but in the hands of Steffi Graf or Venus Williams, it's a Wimbledon title waiting to happen. Then he grabbed the basketball and he says, this NBA Wilson basketball, in my hands, it's nothing but a ball. But he says, in the hands of Michael Jordan, it's 5 NBA championship titles. And he took a football and he says, in my hands, this is just an average football. But he says, in the hands of Tom Brady, now it's 7 Super Bowl championships. My hands with a scalpel, chances are I'm going to cut my hands and lose a few fingers in the process. But in the hands of a skilled surgeon, it's a blade waiting to perform a surgery to save somebody's life. In the hands of somebody that doesn't know anything about firearms, it's probably a chance to lose your own life. But in the hands of a soldier, it is protecting a nation and saving a life in the process. What's in your hands tonight? Throw it down. Place it before God, the master of everything. Let him change it. Let it transform it. And then pick it back up. So then your hands are so skilled as that. And that he will lead you to something bigger and greater than you can ever imagine. Something that you couldn't even think about today, because you find yourself as Moses, as that 80-year-old man with no country, with no identity, with no future, with no hope, with anxiety, with fear, with depression. And God gave him the opportunity. He's giving you the same one tonight. So he's asking you on an individual basis, what's in your hand? Me? My staff is on the floor tonight. Because everything that these hands touched, I've made a mess out of it. These are messy hands. And I'm tired of making a mess. I'm tired of it. I come surrendered tonight to God, and I throw that staff down and say, do something. Do something. What was in these hands, what's on the floor right before you, do something with it. I'll wait, and I will follow. And take me wherever you need me to go. Gentlemen, that is my prayer for each and every one of you tonight. Look at your hands tonight. Look at the mess that those hands at some point of your life has made. They've made positive things, don't get me wrong, but I'm sure it's more of a mess than the positivity that we could ever imagine that they've made. So take those hands filled, your arms filled with whatever it is, drop it before God tonight. As he asks you the same question, what's in your hand? Drop it before him. Let him take that and turn it around. Make something great. This is your second chance. This is your opportunity tonight. This is a turning point. It was a turning point for Moses, at that moment in Exodus 4, and this is a turning point for you. This is your Exodus 4 moment. Or you can walk away from that mountain, but your Exodus chapter 5 will never be written if you don't obey Exodus chapter 4. I can't tell you what to do. I would plead to God that you would take this opportunity and that you would stand in line with me, throwing staffs down before the Lord tonight and just saying, do what you will, because you are the master. Because in my hands, my marriage is a wreck. In my hands, my children are a wreck. My finances are a wreck. My home is a wreck. My career is a wreck. My health is a wreck. But in your hands, God, in your hands, my marriage is blessed because your word says that. I am healed because your word says that. My children will never depart from your word because your word says that. Your word says that you own the cattle and the fields. That my treasures in heaven and not here on earth. So that means my finances are taken care of. Whatever it is that I throw at his feet, there's a verse in that Bible that's going to back it up saying it's going to be okay. But I can walk away with my staff and say, I got this. I got this. And there are so many I got this men out there thinking that they can do this on their own apart from God. And they can't. And they fail. And they die among the sheep in the wilderness, never to be heard from again. Moses became one of the greatest men in the Bible. God wants to make you great in your own world. He wants to see you great. It took Moses one moment in his life, made that decision. I'm going for it. I'm all in, God. Here is who I am. It's on the floor. It was a sign of surrender before the living, mighty God. Moses surrendered his identity, his life to him. Will you do the same tonight? Will you surrender your identity tonight to God? Because if you do, and it's time, God's going to ask you, pick up that stick again. And it's not going to be your rod to shepherd sheep. It's going to be your staff to do something bigger and greater. That generations that will come after you will talk about your Exodus 4 moment. Gentlemen, drop your staff tonight. Drop it and wait on God to pick it back up again. That's all I got, guys. Floor is yours, man.